Hi, welcome to my channel, Mission 919, devoted to information, stories, narratives of African achievement, well-being, and prosperity. Today we're going to talk about Mary Ann Shadd, or later Mary Ann Shadd Cary. She was born in 1823 in Wilmington, Delaware. She was the oldest of 13 children. Her father was Abraham Shadd, and her mother, I believe, was Elizabeth Parnell Shadd. Her father was a shoemaker. Her father was an abolitionist in Delaware, which was a slave state, but their house was a station on the Underground Railroad. When it became illegal to educate black children, whatever their status, free or slave, the family moved out of Delaware and into Pennsylvania. And Mary Ann Shadd went to a Quaker boarding school in Westchester, Pennsylvania. After she graduated, she taught. She taught in Pennsylvania and in New Jersey and maybe New York State as well. Later on, after 1850, when the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, after the Mexican War, the family moved to Ontario, to Canada, and Mary Ann Shadd became a advocate for emigration to Canada West, as it was called then, for African Americans. In 1854, she began the newspaper called the Provincial Freeman. It was the first. She was the first editor or publisher of editor and publisher of a newspaper. It was a weekly, by a woman in Canada, and the first black woman in the United States, because the paper was distributed on both sides of the border. Let's see, she was a leader. Actually, her father was a leader in Canada as well. He was elected to a political post in Raleigh, Ontario. Mary Ann Shadd was a very important figure. In 1855, she attended the Negro Convention in Philadelphia, and she was the one of the few, or maybe the only woman present, and she was the only woman allowed to speak. And she was controversial for her emigrationist views, but she was allowed to be seated at the convention. She gave a talk, which was very well received in the room, but in terms of the recording of the minutes of the meeting, her presence is underplayed, which I think is a little bit of a case in general with her contributions. Ontario, or Chatham, Ontario, became a center, political center for the struggle against slavery in the 1850s. It was the place where a provisional constitution was drafted by John Brown and other radical abolitionists in 1858. Her brother was definitely involved in at least aiding the plans for the Harper's Ferry raid by John Brown that would happen in October of 1859, and I'm assuming she must have been involved as well. Her newspaper lasted from 1853 or 1854 until late 1860. I think the last issue was during the secession crisis, after Lincoln was elected in November of 1860, and before the war actually begins in April of 1861. So her newspaper is the last The last issue was published, I believe, in November of 1860. In 1856 or 1857, she marries a barber, Thomas Cary, and she has 2 children with him. Unfortunately, he dies in 1860. She comes back to the United States, and in 1863, she is, sorry for the noise. In 1863, she is the major recruiter for a recruiter of black soldiers in the Union Army in Indiana, and she is invited to do this job, this important, vital, necessary job, by none other than Martin Delany, one of the true giants of the period. So, this is someone who was really a leader. For me, that crystallized it, like knowing that she was given that role, when the war was really up for grabs, and the role of African Americans in the war was the central question of the war, really. So for her to be given a job of that incredible import proves to me that she was one of the towering figures of the age, and that her role has been downplayed or erased or elided subsequently, because of sexism, essentially. And so it's not a question of her being, some representative figure or, included or something. She was at the center at the time, and so that fact needs to be acknowledged now. So after the war, she moves to D.C., and she actually goes to Howard Law School. Now, there's not a lot of information, at least that I could glean, about these years, but it takes her a long time to actually get her law degree. But she graduates from Howard Law School in 1883, I believe, and she lives until 1893. But it's unclear what she was able to actually do with her law degree. I mean, women, as a general rule, didn't go to law school in 1869, and they certainly didn't practice law. So, I mean, she was just a towering figure in so many ways. Anyway, so she was, I know in her last year, she was very involved with the movement for women's suffrage. And she dies at the age of 69 in June of 1893. I think there's a lot more to be said about her. There's a lot more to understand about her role in Canada. She is recognized in Canada as a person of historical significance. That's a category they have up there. So I think that's wonderful. But I think she's probably less well known in the United States, and that obviously needs to change. Let's see, what else? Oh, I wanted to say that Canada was really an area of, you could say, strategic depth for the anti-slavery movement and for the black community as a whole, because during post-Fugitive Slave Act, the repression and suppression, you could say, of black people in the North was intense. There was a great deal of fear and apprehension about bounty hunters, and of course the legal system was completely stacked against anybody accused or claimed to be a fugitive slave. And so Canada represented an area of greater freedom, greater room to organize and to think and to try out new ideas and to wage the ideological and agitational battle in those very intense years leading up to the actual outbreak of the war. After 1850, basically the war was already on, It was just taking place in the form of ideological combat, and then also in Kansas, in the struggle there, um, to see whether or not Kansas would be Kansas would enter the Union as either a slave or free state. Um, so Ann Shadd Cary was at the heart of the struggle, in really one of its most important centers, because the struggle against slavery in the United States was not only a national struggle, it was it crossed borders into Canada, and I would say and Mexico. It was a continental struggle, and it was an intercontinental struggle. It was a struggle of the Western Hemisphere and also Europe. So, and Canada West, or Ontario, is one of the most important nodes, centers of that struggle. So, in the name of the ancestors and the unborn, who are the same, Ashe, 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 and we'll see you next time.